start off by saying welcome to the Guava and Osterman Research webinar. My name is Q Mangus. I'll be your host today. I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Guava. We have a large number of people here on the call. We're really excited to bring you this webinar on social media management and archiving as a best practice. Now, you Michael Osterman from Research. Discussing this topic. Now, Mike is an expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 20 years of experience in the high-tech research industry and has spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging and collaboration industries. A couple to take note of: we will be having some Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to put those through in the chat or the panels there in the WebEx. So you'll see that there on the side. So feel free to put them through as we're going along, and we'll address them at the end. So as you have questions, feel free. Go ahead and turn the time over to Michael. One moment, we'll get him on the line here.
Hear me?
For being here.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you so much. Let's get started. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to join with us and really discuss why you need to manage social media, why you need to archive the content in social media. So let's get started with just a little bit about Osterman Research so you know where we're coming from. What you're seeing in that blank gray space is actually a sunny picture of Seattle. We don't get very many of those, so I like to advertise them. So just take my word for it. There actually is some sun in Seattle at times anyway. So a little bit about Osterman Research. You mentioned we are a market research and consulting firm that really is very focused on the messaging, web, and collaboration industries. We spend a lot of our time dealing with communication and collaboration technologies, and really social media is a critical part of that. In research that we've done recently, for example, we found that the typical user spends about 153 minutes a day doing something in email, whether that's responding to messages, looking for contacts, looking for files, and so forth. But they're also spending now 51 minutes a day doing something in social media, and that's up substantially from just a few years ago. So really what we're focused on here today is looking at some of the research we've done around social media to see where it's going, to see what organizations are doing with it, and really to explore some of the problems that organizations need to address that in part they really haven't. So, we all hear anecdotally about, the continuing growth in social media. We all use things like Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. As you can see, these are statistics from early 2014. And what we're finding is that, there's continued growth in the use of social media. Well over a billion active users of Facebook, 650 million or so users of Twitter, nearly 300 million users of LinkedIn, and so forth. Numbers continue to grow. Now there are some differences in the audiences for these. Obviously, most of these, like Facebook and Twitter, are somewhat consumer focused. LinkedIn is more business focused. But we really this mix of business and personal. For the background noise here, trying to phone. So we need to see this mix of business and personal to the point where it's almost difficult to distinguish, what is a business use of a social media tool and what is a personal use, because the use is really quite mixed. Finding, though, and the real impact that we're going to be talking about today is the use of social media on corporate networks. This came from a study that we did recently where we looked at basically mid-sized and large organizations for the most part in North America. And we asked, what is the penetration of various social media tools on corporate networks? We're not talking about people using tools, these social media tools on their personal devices. This is what's really hitting the corporate network. And here, there's fairly substantial growth across all of the tools that we looked at, things like Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and so forth. We're seeing really substantial growth in tools like Google+, various types of enterprise-grade social media tools, LinkedIn, and so forth. So, really across the board this increasing penetration of social media across a variety of platforms, and we're going to do this more in 2014 as these tools find wider and wider use. So organizations about their anticipated changes in social media use. Do you expect it to increase, decrease, or stay about the same? And you can see here very few organizations are anticipating that social media is going to decline over time. We're seeing most organizations saying it's going to increase, even fewer saying it's going to remain the same. So, not to hammer home the point too much, but social media use is increasing on your corporate network, and it's something that you have to pay more and more attention to over time. There are really a variety of problems with social media. It can be a tremendous benefit from a user productivity standpoint, from the perspective of enabling decision support, being experts in your organization, and so forth, but it also carries with it a number of problems. One of the things we found that was the most serious issue in our survey, it was that of social media related policies. And we found overall that policies are lacking in most organizations. And that's not to say that the social media policies don't exist. We found that over 3/4 of organizations, for example, have some sort of a published social media policy. The fundamental problem, though, is that only in about 1/4 of organizations is that a detailed and thorough policy, where organizations have really spelled out what constitutes acceptable use of social media, when it can be used, when it cannot be used, what you say, what you cannot say, the tools that are used, and so forth. So it's critically important that organizations have a social media capability and a social media policy around that if they are going to allow any social media use. But we're finding that most organizations today, although they may have a policy, it's not really a very detailed and thorough policy, and it doesn't give employees much guidance on what they should or shouldn't be doing. We also found that among organizations that have a policy focused on social media, most employees really don't know very much about it. They may have a sense that there is a policy out there, but they really don't know what's in it, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, and so forth. So first and foremost, organizations need to have policies focused on social media, and those really should be part of their overall communication and collaboration tool policies. Any acceptable use policy on social media, for example, should be part and parcel with the email acceptable use policy. The second problem we found is malware. Found, for example, that a fairly substantial proportion of social media users report that their own social media accounts have been hacked, or maybe they've been the victim of malware delivered through social media. The problem, though, is that a lot of these people, about 1 out of 14, and this was a survey with end users, really don't know if they've been hacked or if they've been infected. Often, it's difficult to tell, for example, looking at your Facebook feed, looking at a Twitter feed, if you are actually seeing malware, if you've actually clicked on a link that could lead to a malware-laden site and so forth. That about 1/4 of organizations are concerned or very concerned about getting malware through social media, in part because social media is one of those relatively new areas in terms of malware protection, and simply a lot of organizations don't have anything that is going to be scanning the short URLs that you'll see in a Twitter feed, for example. They're not going to be looking at the ads that you might find in Facebook. There's virtually nothing that's really focused on LinkedIn from a malware filtration policy. So it's going to be very difficult for most organizations to even know if they've been infected until it's too late. Interesting is that even though organizations don't have a lot of robust tools focused on malware prevention in social media, they really are aware that there is a serious issue. For example, 42% of organizations believe that Facebook is risky or extremely risky from a social malware perspective. 35% believe the same thing about YouTube, 27% about Google+, and so forth. And what we're finding is that there's a rough correlation between the consumer-oriented nature of a social media tool and the risk that people believe it poses to the organization, which actually makes sense. If you're dealing with Facebook, you're more likely to get malware than if you're dealing with LinkedIn. So we'll get the notion that social media is a very serious ingress point for malware, but they're not really doing very much about it. That obviously needs to be corrected. You need some sort of solution that can look at social media content on your corporate network and then prevent that content from reaching your users. archiving. We find that the vast majority of organizations really don't archive their social media content at all. There's really very little archiving going on. Most organizations, allow social media use on their corporate network, but then they do nothing with the content. They don't police the content to see that maybe sensitive information is being leaked out. They don't look for offensive jokes or sexually harassing content that might be sent in social media. And one thing that's a very useful exercise to do is just go to Twitter, for example. Not to pick on them, but go to Twitter and look for comments like "my boss is stupid," "my client is stupid," "I lied to a client," whatever the offensive phrase is. Look for like that, and you will see one after another of this content that's being sent across Twitter. A lot of it by employees. My one from a couple of years ago was an employee who tweeted, "I love to see my boss get drunk at work," and then she posted a short URL with a map to the company location. Why she did that, I have no idea, but that's the kind of thing that you really, if you're a decision maker for your company, you probably should pay attention to, because it is a very serious issue. It could get your organization into a world of hurt. So, there is content that may be sent through Twitter that really does constitute a business record, maybe a communication with a client or a prospect, or publishing an opinion on something, providing a link to an article, what have you. In some contexts, that can be regarded as business records. That's the kind of stuff that you should be archiving. Now, financial services industry, there's some fairly clear direction. FINRA Regulatory Notice 10-06 that came out a few years ago basically said, you do need to have some level of archiving for your social media content, just like you do for any other content, email, instant messaging, files, and so forth. And so for financial services firms, the direction is fairly clear. For the rest of us, it's really not. It's absolutely essential that you preserve business records and electronic media regardless of where they may be found, and social media is one of those avenues that you do have to protect. Regulatory perspective, if you're in a heavily regulated organization, but also from a legal perspective for discovery and so forth, and also just because there's valuable content in social media that you might want to preserve, maybe for some sort of a big data mining project, for example, to look at customer sentiment, what people are saying about your organization, what your employees are saying about your organization or clients, and so forth. There's a number of cases focused on social media that are important, several legal cases, and I won't go through the detail of all of these. But in the first case, Armstrong versus Sherville, the defendant requested a complete copy of all the communications in Facebook. That's something that if you, as a defendant or a plaintiff in an organization, and you're going through some sort of an e-discovery exercise and you can't produce, that could result in fine sanctions by the court. And we're going to see more and more of this over time as social media gets pulled in to the mix of electronic content that's part of e-discovery. Very similar, they had to bring in their Facebook content and any other communications they had with class members in that action. Again, a case where the parties had to have access to Facebook content. Most organizations don't have that today. Now, you can get an archive, for example, from Facebook. You can get an archive from Twitter. But organizations are under no obligation to preserve that content for you, and generally they're not going to preserve content long term, and you can't necessarily rely on them to capture all of the relevant content that you might need. Again, the regulatory issue I noted, Regulatory Notice 10-06 from FINRA, is really good advice for any organization. If you're going to be archiving email or instant messages or files or any other sort of electronic content, social media really does need to be part of that mix. Other problems in terms of archive, the government of Queensland, for example, published their opinion that really there's no difference in social media in the context of whether it's an email or instant message or any other sort of electronic content. So social media really is just part of the mix. Now, there's some use cases today where you do need to be careful in terms of what you're looking at in social media, what you're evaluating, and so forth. For example, it is illegal to discriminate against people based on race, the color of their skin, their religion, their sexual orientation, and so forth. And so if you were going to be looking at prospective employees' Facebook posts or Twitter feeds, for example, you need to ensure that you're not considering stuff that would be illegal for you to consider. Now, best practice in terms of hiring employees, if you are going to be evaluating their social media content, is to have someone outside of the HR department through all of these prospects' social media content, pulls out the stuff that you as a hiring manager are not supposed to look at by law, and then feeds it to you in some sort of an archive so that you can evaluate this information properly, but then also retain it so that if you decide not to hire somebody, you could defend yourself and say, well, we never considered information that it was illegal for us to consider. Very few organizations today are doing that. If HR, you absolutely need to be doing that because there will be cases where somebody will cite social media content is the reason you didn't hire them. You have to be able to defend yourself if it ever goes before some sort of a government regulator, or if, God forbid, you get sued because of it. Firing employees is the same thing. There have been a number of situations in which employees have been fired because of stuff they posted on social media that was detrimental to the company, it insulted the client, what have you. You need to have an archive of that content so that you can demonstrate this is exactly why you were fired, this is when you posted the information, this is what you posted, and so forth. If an employee deletes that content and you don't have a record of that information as the reason for firing them, again, you can get into a world of hurt. We found in our research is essentially the ignorance of social media. And I don't use that in a pejorative way, but most decision makers in an organization, whether they're in a line of business or in the IT department, really don't know that much about what's going on in the context of social media use on their corporate networks. For example, we found in our research that 45% of social media users report their employers not monitoring their use of social media at work. And a lot of employers don't. Now, obviously, there's not much you can do if people are going to be using social media on a personally owned device, but if it's traversing your corporate network, you need to know what's going on there. You need to be able to do keyword searches and really understand the content that's flowing back and forth between your employees and the world at large. We found only about 1 out of 7 IT departments are almost fully aware of the media content that's going across the corporate network. That number needs to be much, much higher. We also found that the majority of organizations really don't monitor or screen any sort of content that passes through media tools on the corporate network. Again, a major problem that needs to be corrected. And a lot of decision makers really aren't sure whether or not their organization has been infiltrated by malware using some sort of a social media tool. So again, there are areas where organizations need to really develop a better understanding of what's going on because they are at risk if they're not managing this content properly. Now, obviously, this is going to depend upon the industry you're in, how well versed you are in social media tools, the level of tools you have available to you today, and so forth. But first and foremost, any organization needs to understand how and why social media is used. One we still find in our research is that some decision makers are simply scared of social media or they don't see its business value, sort of where email was maybe back in the mid-90s, where people just weren't really sold on the notion of email as a useful business tool. Today, it'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that doesn't regard email as a critically important business tool. We still find a lot of people that don't really value social media. You really do need to understand how and why it's used. It can be a tremendous marketing vehicle. It can offer ways for particular employees in your company to become gurus in the industry. It can be a way to connect with prospects, to respond to customer service inquiries, to respond to complaints, and so forth. So while a lot of decision makers we find in our research today want to implement some sort of a draconian control that says, nope, nobody can use Facebook, nobody can use Twitter, LinkedIn, what have you, you really do need to back off from that and understand how it's used and really understand how it can add value to your company. Second is to develop very detailed and very thorough policies. As I mentioned earlier, most organizations today really aren't doing that. They don't have the policies in place that are going to protect the organization or give any sort of guidance to employees about what they can or cannot do. Now, those policies obviously are going to vary from company to company, but they should include things like, what constitutes use of social media media. What tools can be used, what tools cannot be used, what are you supposed to share, what are you not supposed to share. And it's important to have information in those policies that will help guide employees about, turning on even things like geolocation in their social media tools. For example, you've got an employee that continually tweets about all their trips to Bentonville, Arkansas, or all trips to Minneapolis. Put two and two together, look at these tweets over time, and get that your company is maybe doing a deal with Walmart in the first case, or maybe Target in the second. There can be lots of innocuous data that flows through social media that can reveal information about your company that you don't necessarily want to. So your social media policies need to focus on things like that. Geolocation, employees posting their travel plans, and so forth. Third, you need to monitor and manage employee use of social media. You need to monitor what's going on your corporate network. Obviously, there's not a lot you can do about what happens on personally owned devices or an employee's home computers when they're on their own time, but you can monitor at least what goes on your own network. You need to manage that appropriately. And finally, you need to archive content. There are business records that you need to preserve in social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and many other tools out there. If there's business content, and there probably is, you need to preserve that just like you preserve email or preserving email in a very robust archiving system so that you can go back after the fact, search for content, and produce it quickly and efficiently when you need it. If you're ever going to be involved in a lawsuit in the future, and you probably are, you are going to probably need social media content as part of that discoverable content. That's my part of the presentation. Here's our contact information. Q, I'm going to hand it back to you for the Q&A.
Great, Michael. Great information, and thanks everyone for your participation. I encourage you, especially because it's timely, to visit Michael's blog there, or the Osterman blog, because there is a post that I just saw the other day about some of the things that we talked about, some crazy tweets that people had put out. So go out there and look at that. There's some interesting ones, but just a little side note there. Now, once feel free to put any questions through on the Q&A or the chat, and we will address those. There are a couple that came through, Michael, so we'll address those right now. And if you have any, let's go ahead and get those as well. So the first one we have is just kind of a follow-up question to what we'd been talking about is, was this research done across all verticals? For example, banking customers have policies in place that do not allow social media for the vast majority of employees.
Yeah, done across a wide range of verticals. We did have some financial services firms in the mix, but really it wasn't focused on any one particular vertical. And your contact is right. I mean, financial services firms tend to have some fairly strict requirements about what can be tweeted and so forth. And it's interesting, if you go into the FINRA website and you look for disciplinary actions against broker-dealers, hedge fund advisors, and so forth, you'll see an increasing number of infractions related to social media, where broker-dealers, for example, were tweeting stuff that was inappropriate. They were talking about stocks in a way that maybe they shouldn't have, or the organization wasn't capturing that information. And we're seeing more and more of that over time in the financial services industry.
A few more. So really, looks like the next one is, can we monitor and archive something as personal as social media?
We can. Certainly, I mean, there's a couple of things to consider. If it's going across your corporate network, definitely. I mean, any acceptable use policy for any sort of communication or collaboration tool should be that if you're sending information across the corporate network, the organization can monitor it. They can search for keywords, they can capture it, archive it, whatever they want to do. Now, obviously, that's going to vary by jurisdiction. In some European countries, it's not quite the same as it is here in the U.S., but certainly should spell that out in the policy that you have a right to capture that information and do whatever you want with it. The second is, if it's almost like a morals clause in an employment contract. If people are going to be tweeting or posting on Facebook really inappropriate stuff, even if it's a personal device, if they are associated with your brand, with your company, with your, in any way, there should be something in the policy that says don't do this. There's a lot less control you have over what people do personally, but kind of at least make some attempt to say, don't represent this company or this brand in an unflattering way.
Great, perfect. Thank you. Let's see. There's a few more here. This with the last one as well. Is it best practice to use an enterprise social media solution?
It is. It depends really on what you want to do with social media. We're finding growing use of enterprise social media tools, things like IBM Connections, Jive, Yammer. I mean, there's lots of them out there. And it really depends to an extent on your corporate culture. You've got a corporate culture that fosters information sharing, that fosters collaboration. Enterprise social tools are going to work very well. They're going to enable you, for example, to find expertise in your company, particularly if you're in a large or geographically distributed company. You're obviously not going to know everybody in the company. If you have an enterprise social tool, that allows you to go in and say, okay, I just had a customer call with these 3 problems. I need to find an expert in my company that can address that because he or she has experience in dealing with these kind of issues, or maybe they were a former employee of that company, what have you. Enterprise social can be a great tool for kind of a thing, for information sharing, for fostering decision making in a way that's more efficient than doing it by email or telephone. So yeah, organizations should consider enterprise social, not to abandon sort of the consumer-focused stuff, but really to add enterprise social as a way of improving collaboration and communication.
Kind of this one as well. Is there any particular one that you suggest? Any particular enterprise social tool?
I recommend a particular one. There are some very good ones. The ones I mentioned: Connections, Jive, Yammer, and so forth. I'm probably most familiar with Connections, used extensively by IBM and used extensively by their customers and so forth. It has a lot of very nice capabilities, but there are lots of really good social tools out there, and overall they're really not very expensive. Again, it sort of goes back to the corporate culture. What how do you information sharing and expertise sharing across the organization? If you've got an organization that values hoarding of information by division or department or work group, media is not going to work very well because you don't have the sort of social infrastructure in place to implement the social media tool that's going to help you exploit that. So you really need to understand your organization and then buy a tool that's best going to exploit that.
Awesome. Okay, that looks like all the questions right now. Second here to see if any more were coming through. It doesn't look like it. Thanks, Michael. Great information. I wanted a reminder to everybody. Just wanted to mention a couple of things. One, everybody in attendance today will receive a copy of the Osterman Research White Paper, Why Social Media Management and Archiving is a Best Practice. There will be an email with a link to that and also to the recording of this webinar. So you'll be getting that. Look for that. Also, I have developed a sample social media policy. Basically, looked to some organizations, looked experts to see kind of some things that should be in your social media policy. In the email for this webinar, you should have received a link to download that. If you didn't, please contact us. You can contact us at questions@guava.com, and we can send that link out to you. It's kind of a reference piece for you to be able to help when you're developing your social media policy. Also, we have solutions, if you don't know, to be able to help you filter, monitor, and archive social media. If you want information on those solutions, feel free to reach or visit us at guava.com. Well, thank everyone for being here, and Michael, thanks again for the information. Great information presented. It's always a pleasure to have you present for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have the rest of your good day. Thank you.